Greetings, everyone, once again. This is Joyce Davis, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And we're coming to you again with another Great Decisions discussion program. We once again thank our partner, the Frederickson Library, for sponsoring this program to allow people in our region to engage in thoughtful discussion of some of the most pressing international issues of our day. And let me tell you, last week's discussion was quite pressing. We were talking about Russia, and we got some very good insights from Dr. Mehdi Norbash, as well as from the video that was shown, although we also saw how quickly things can change. Tonight, we have an expert from Elizabethtown College, but I won't tell you who that is because tonight we also have a new moderator, another moderator who I think is quite expert in these topics and the topic of industrial policy, which to some of us might sound a little boring, but the reality is it's connected to some of the most important aspects of our lives. So Russell, let me turn it over to you to be the moderator for the night.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you very much. And welcome everybody to our program this evening. The concluding program, by the way, in our Great Decisions series, but what I think may well be the most important of our discussions, notwithstanding the discussion on Russia last week. This one has great importance because it touches on so many important things: national security, individual and national prosperity, economic livelihood, and, to be honest, our creature comforts. For instance, how many of us even knew the phrase supply chain until disruptions brought on by the pandemic emptied store shelves of foods, toys, clothes, medicines, and horror of horrors, toilet paper? Now, we all have a sense of how everything we buy or obtain goes through an often complicated process of manufacture, transport, and warehousing before we take possession. Well, tonight, we'll hear not just about supply chains, but about when or if governments should intervene to protect or promote certain industries, benefits and downsides to free trade, and just what kind of relationship should we pursue with countries that don't play by the rules. China, call your office. As always, we will view a video from the Foreign Policy Association, which sponsors the Great Decision series. And then from our resident expert tonight, Dr. Sanjay Paul, Associate Professor of Economics at Elizabethtown College. After Dr. Paul's response to the video, we will open the program up for your questions. Right now, the Great Decisions presentation on industrial policy.
2, a 9-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Today's Great Decisions challenge is industrial policy. We have 3 main considerations before thinking about U.S. foreign policy options. First of all, let's consider what exactly is industrial policy. We then look at the supply chain crisis, followed by economic policies. We begin with industrial policy. This is when a government identifies a critically important industry that it would like to preserve, protect, promote, or perhaps even establish. And it does so for national security or economic competitive reasons. The government then uses the power at its disposal to support and/or sustain those identified industries. What sorts of options do governments have to support critically important industries? Subsidizing is one of the most popular. This is a direct payment, financial support for the industry to guarantee that it can remain competitive and stay in business. Tariffs can be placed on foreign products that otherwise would compete with the industry. Those tariffs are taxes that raise the price of foreign goods and make American-produced goods more competitive. Restrictive legislation on what can enter the country, or simply using tax policy to the advantage of select industries. What sorts of industries are supported by the U.S. government? The first category would be underlying or foundational industries, the sorts of industries upon which other industries, businesses, and livelihoods depend. National defense is a pretty obvious industry that any government would want to preserve and protect. And then finally, as we've seen more recently, in times of healthcare crises, such as a global pandemic, the medical industries must be shielded and promoted. The question, however, is when are we crossing the line? We have a pretty good sense of what capitalist economic philosophy is, beginning with Adam Smith in 1776 and moving forward. Far too often people assume that capitalism does not believe in government. That would be Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, among her many classics, in which she argued government is almost always intrusive and in the way, and that capitalism can only exist in a pure form if there is no government at all. Reading Adam Smith, it is clear that government is necessary. Someone has to write the rules of economic engagement, enforce contracts that are violated, and yes, provide support for the general population, for example, through national defense, or perhaps these foundational industries, and I think everyone can agree that if there is an immediate health crisis, government intervention on behalf of certain industries does indeed serve the whole without violating the basic principles of capitalism. But what is outside the bounds? At what point are we no longer functioning like a capitalist economy? What sorts of industries should never be supported by the government if that government is to preserve our capitalist integrity? Certainly, any of those that are supported for purely political interest would be outside the bounds of acceptability. Maybe the supply chain crisis that we are currently experiencing, which is to a large extent a matter of convenience for American consumers. Let's then look at that supply chain situation. The goods that we buy are produced locally and internationally, although increasingly Americans are purchasing foreign goods, widgets and gidgets, as the old economic books used to call products. They come to our shores from somewhere else. And of course, they don't originate there. There is a massive global supply chain of producers, assemblers, designers. The raw materials come from one location, they move to another one, probably in another country, for initial manufacturing, and they make their way through the system. We can find the point of origin. We can trace every single product all the way through the global system until it makes its way to its destination. And of course, this is a gross simplification of what the global supply chain really looks like, because each of those mid-destination points is also where other parts of the product are going to arrive. The leading economic philosophy today is called just-in-time strategy. You want the pieces to arrive just in time for assembly so the increasingly finished product can move to its next point of production. Because of that, if there is a disruption anywhere in the system, it could be an armed conflict among nations, it could be a global pandemic, it could be an earthquake or hurricane, it could be a new government just changing policy. It has profound implications throughout the global supply chain. The so-called ripple effect creates massive disruptions in the arrival of goods. That is what we've experienced in the last 2 years. One reason there is a global supply chain is because we purchase more and more of our products from abroad. Maybe part of the product or the entire product is assembled, manufactured, packaged, and shipped from across boundaries. If we go back in time, just a few generations, overwhelmingly Americans purchased and consumed American supplied goods. Made in America meant something, and America was a country that was largely self-sufficient. But over time, as you can see from this graph, the portion of the things that we consume that are made abroad has increased. Also, the volume of what we have consumed, what we purchase, has increased. So today, a majority of the items that we find in local stores are manufactured abroad. That makes us highly vulnerable to any disruptions in the global supply chain. Trade deals are a very big reason for that. The globalization of liberal economic policies, and by liberal, I mean capitalism and free trade. If we look at the rise of free trade agreements, bilateral, regional, and international, they align pretty closely with the foreign origin of supplies. The broader we place this global trading network, the more local economies can provide material, labor, sourcing, and production of the goods that we consume. Manufacturing here in the United States, as a result, has been in severe decline. And that is something that we see throughout the Western world. It is the maturation of societies and economies. We evolved from an agrarian subsistence economy to a self-sustaining industrial society to post-industrial and now largely a service society. That means almost all the things that we buy have foreign origins. Economics from a capitalist perspective is pretty straightforward. This is your classic supply-demand graph. If supply and demand meet at that point is called equilibrium, the price of the product will be reasonable. However, if the demand increases without an increase in supply, we're going to see an increase in the price of that product. There are fewer widgets and gadgets available compared to the demand for them. Generally speaking, according to capitalism and Adam Smith, there's an invisible hand that fixes this problem. Either the production will increase or new suppliers will join the market, and in so doing, that returns the point to equilibrium. No need for government intervention. The invisible hand is the rational self-interest of individuals and corporations responding to market demands and opportunities. It is the beauty and the majesty of capitalism. Everyone pursues their own self-interest, and in so doing, every good and every service needed by society will be provided. We do have crises of supply and demand. We saw that beginning in early 2020, when suddenly everyone in the world needed a mask because of COVID. A shock to the international system that pushed the demand to an extreme to the point that supply could never keep up. COVID and global pandemics have that sort of an impact on the supply-demand charts. So here is our crisis in 2020. There's an enormous demand for masks and other protective gear. The supply simply cannot keep up. Market forces alone do not allow us to generate the production needed to meet the needs of the American society, not to mention the world, when it comes to protective gear such as masks. Government intervention was needed. The government had to direct existing industries to begin to produce gloves, masks, gowns for those who are on the front line, and all sorts of other high-demand items on the market. Our supply chain crisis has many stress points. A large number of them are overseas. Simply put, overseas markets are having a difficult time keeping up with demand. Disruptions from the pandemic or other external events have caused disruptions in the supply chain. But even when products reach American shores, there are more supply chain stress points. Our ports of call are overwhelmed. From Jacksonville to Seattle, Los Angeles to Boston, we cannot find enough workers, and there doesn't seem to be enough time in the day to process all of the arriving international goods. And so those ships begin to pile up offshore, which of course costs money, and it raises the price of the goods. But even once they get inside the port system, we have a crisis of delivery in the United States. We are woefully understaffed in key industries, including transportation, such as trucking. Capitalism has a very simple answer for that. The market will correct this problem when truck drivers are paid a higher salary and better benefits, perhaps provided better job conditions. But to date, we've not been able to keep up with the decline in the number of truckers. So at all points in the system, from your local grocery store to the foreign point of origin, there are stress points in the global supply chain, and capitalism to date does not seem to be able to fix them all. Why do we have this crisis? Well, a part of it, and I wouldn't say an overwhelming part of it, but certainly a portion of the reason is our relationship with China. Under the Trump administration and continued into the Biden administration, we've been trying to disengage to some extent from China. We have placed tariffs on Chinese products, quotas on their imports, out of a concern that China is not playing by the rules. It is cheating to get an advantage, and also out of a concern that many things that China produces are of critical importance for the United States, for our military, our automobile industry, our energy infrastructure. We're simply giving China too much leverage over the well-being of the United States. Some disentanglement of this trade relationship needs to happen. The global consumption surge that's been underway since the Cold War ended. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the rise of a truly global trading network, and with China's entry into it, many high population countries have become wealthier. There's a very clear relationship between liberal economic policy, meaning capitalism, open markets, and free trade, and economic prosperity. With prosperity comes consumption, whether it's houses, Rolex watches, or any point in between. That surge places a lot of pressure on the global supply chain. Since COVID has begun to end, there's been a buying spree, especially in the Western world, but really globally, that has overwhelmed the supply chain industry. And finally, here in the United States, what is called the Great Resignation. For a host of reasons, Americans are not going back to work. When this lecture was taped in early November 2021, we were at an all-time high for Americans out of the workplace by their own volition. Maybe they learned something because of COVID, that the stress just isn't worth it, that the rat race isn't paying off. For whatever reason, they're beginning to value staying at home, and millions of Americans are choosing to do exactly that. And if we're short in staff, it's very difficult to get products to the shelf and into the consumer's hands. For these reasons, we have a supply chain crisis in 2021 that's likely to still be ongoing as you watch this lecture. We now turn to economic philosophy, the policies that we choose in making our domestic and foreign policy. The most essential economic debate is between mercantilism on one end and free trade on the other. This is not a light switch. You're not really one or the other. Most countries are somewhere in between, the gradations. China is a mercantilist nation. It maximizes its exports with a lot of government assistance, and it minimizes its imports with a lot of protection measures provided by Beijing. In so doing, China is able to accumulate a very large amount of money. It has a trade imbalance in its favor, exporting a great deal importing very little. For every product that the U.S. sends to China, China sends 4 products to the United States. That means American dollars are piling up in China. It can use those dollars to subsidize its industries. It can also use them to build the global economic system that it's been working on for several years now. $1.54 trillion in the new Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative. Japan since 1945 has acted like a mercantilist country. We have allowed Japan to do this. We've given it what we call infant market protections, allowing it to regenerate itself after the devastation of World War II in the hopes that it would move from mercantilist towards a free trade approach. For the most part, Japan has not done that. For much of its first century in existence, the United States was also a mercantilist power. After World War II, we went all in on the free trade side, both for us and the international system. And as the leading state, the most impressive country after World War II, we were able to require nations to pursue free trade policies. That process began at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the United States met with its allies before the Second World War had even ended. And what we said to them was unlike the statement of any emerging hegemon in modern history. Normally, when a country becomes the dominant power, it takes territory and privileges away from the other powers. The United States at Bretton Woods did the exact opposite. We said to our allies, you'll keep your territory, we'll open our markets to you so that you can build your economies with the expectation that someday you will open your markets to us. It was a stunning development and one of the most important events of the 20th century. So how exactly does this free trade philosophy work? Here we have a number of nation states. Some of them are trading freely with one another. In so doing, they form an informal alliance of free trade nations, and they behave differently. Normally, countries that trade with each other do not go to war with each other. As nations on the outside begin to observe, see the accumulation of wealth among the free traders, the lack of war among them, it decides to join the group, to change its stripes, and to become a free trade nation. Conflicts that occur are largely between the free trade nations and the non-free trade, or fully outside of the free trade alliance. Those countries as well can realize that if they trade freely, adopt capitalist economic philosophies, they'll be more peaceful at home and also more prosperous as well. So by this point, almost the entire world is inside this free trade agreement. 2 nations, as you can see, are refusing to play along. Those are mercantilist nations. And of course, they're not using free trade policies. They're the outliers in the system. Japan and China are the classic examples. What we have decided to do is to embrace them and to allow them to join the free trade network, even though they're behaving like mercantilist nations. This is a very big risk because they are greatly advantaged by their mercantilist policies, yet they have access to our economic markets. So how did China get here? I explained Japan earlier, post-World War II, allow them to develop, we give them a lot of latitude. That's not the case with China. It begins with the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Deng Xiaoping and other technocrats succeeded him and took a much more pragmatic view to economics. They created specialized economic zones along the coastline that functioned like free trade regions within a communist country. Cold War ended, global trade markets expanded, China was allowed into the World Trade Organization and given highly favorable terms of trade, under the assumption that by joining the WTO, it would adopt free trade policies. It clearly has not. As we look at the global supply chain today, China is at the center of many of the paths of production and shipment, and that translates into a great deal of leverage for the People's Republic of China. That is why industrial policy is a great decision. It affects our national security and economic well-being. One example of China's dominance and its leverage is that of rare earth elements. So these are elements, a dozen, two, maybe three of them, that are found in very low concentrations in the ground, but they're absolutely essential for all things electronic. They're a very valued commodity. China today produces 85% of the world's rare earth metals. And that means if it were to decide to boycott or simply consume them all rather than shipping them abroad, our economic system would face a very severe shortage of many important supply items. So what explains this? Because 50 years ago, we were the dominant rare earth supplier to the world's markets. And over the course of these decades, it has absolutely collapsed. One reason is the environment. As noted earlier, low concentrations means you have to dig up a lot of dirt in order to find enough rare earth metals to be productive. We value our environment. Secondly, as seemingly as when we would decline in production, China would simply take our place, so the market provided the rare earth metals that we needed. And also a healthy dose of short-sightedness, not realizing how this momentum would build over time. China, on the other hand, has risen to the dominant level in rare earth metals. Governments have directed the population and industry to dig up and produce rare earth. The Chinese have purchased third-party areas in other countries, and the Chinese have been playing the long game, seeking to develop leverage over the United States, over Japan, and over the Western world by dominating rare earth metals, and as you can see, they have succeeded. Having considered these three items, we now turn to U.S. foreign policy options. There are three of them: renewed engagement, decoupling of economies, or the adoption of a new industrial policy. What does renewed engagement mean? Well, we go back to the earlier graph. Global free trade network. Most countries are categorized as free traders, with the two obvious outliers. This strategy says keep doing what we're doing. Continue to trade in order to draw in the outliers, and hopefully they will change their color and one day open their markets to free and fair trade. Very few Americans have optimism that this will happen, and almost no one has the patience to wait long enough to see if it will. So the traditional American policy since 1945, create the global trading system, open your markets to foreign trade, and wait out all of the outliers, seems to have run its course. Even though China is a member of the World Trade Organization, it is not adopting the deep and free trade rules of the WTO. And as a result, it's pretty easy to conclude that renewed engagement simply will not work. It's also clear that the Biden administration has reached that conclusion because most of the previous Trump policies on China continue throughout 2021. Okay, how about another option, decoupling? This is a bit involved. Stage one, we begin to shift supply chains to others, trying to avoid supply chains that run through China. Stage number two, significant export restrictions on technology. It's already illegal to ship many high-tech items abroad, such as powerful computers. This would strengthen those rules and expand them to other areas where the Chinese may be copying our technology, mass producing it without all the R&D investment, and then making a profit on it. Stage three, countervailing and anti-dump duties. This means targeting China for its anti-free trade actions relative to its own domestic production. They're dumping when they're selling products below fair market value in order to run businesses out of the market. Then they can dominate that market. And finally, there is stage 4, restricting our foreign investments. These are corporate and private investments that are being sent to China, and restricting the number of Chinese FDIs that are allowed here in the United States. You can see why this second strategy is called decoupling. We're trying to disengage from the Chinese economy. With each and every one of these steps, there will be a counter-Chinese proposal. They will work to harm us for any problems we cause in their economic approach. Mr. Biden, Mr. Xi, you can see them there meeting, a summit-level event. A lot of issues on the table, highly unlikely that those two leaders will agree on either re-engagement or decoupling. Here you can see China's new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, waterways, land routes across the international system and reaching deep into Europe. It appears that China is well on its way to creating its own supply chain. Our last policy option is an industrial policy. And this in and of itself doesn't tell us a lot because it really depends on how ambitious we're going to be. On the least ambitious side, well, we would target a few sectors, really important ones, and we would help those industries reconfigure. Provide them with the incentives, the resources, the tax breaks so they can upgrade their facilities and become more competitive with other countries. On the ambitious side is to fundamentally change the country's economic infrastructure. Either one of those will require a massive amount of government intervention, a very heavy hand in the economy, one that we have not seen in more than a century. Should we decide to be ambitious, we are going to move significantly down the path towards mercantilism. And while people can argue this is a short-term policy for a desperately needed fix, it is very difficult to move from left to right on this economic spectrum. It's much easier to move from right to left. So we should take this with a grain of salt, the temptation of pouring money into key industries so that they can be competitive globally, knowing that that is going to abandon basic economic philosophies relating to capitalism. 3 difficult choices, and that is why this is a great decision in 2022. We've now completed all 8 traditional great decisions topics. There is one bonus lecture that I'll ask you to stay tuned for. We'll look at the Biden foreign policy agenda. Until then, thank you for attending, stay engaged, and make great decisions.
Well, if you have been with us throughout the series, you may feel that one other discussion was more important than this one. But I think you will agree that the issues touched upon in this presentation by the Foreign Policy Association show just how important to us individually and to our country nationally industrial policy is. Very, very crucial. And tonight, we are delighted here at the World Affairs Council to welcome a presentation by a local expert, Dr. Sanjay Paul, Associate Professor of Economics at Elizabethtown College. Dr. Paul, it's good to be with you once again, if only virtually. But without any further ado, I want to turn over this virtual floor to you, sir. It is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Russell. I believe the host has to allow me to use the video, I think.
I just made you the host, so you should have all power. Okay.
So that is not working. So start video because the host has stopped it.
Let me see. I don't know why Zach is host.
Ah, there we are.
All right, good.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Russell. Uh, there is a brief PowerPoint presentation that I could share with the audience, if I may. So,
Do.
here we go. Share. Are you able to see
Yes.
Mhm.
the PowerPoint slide? Great. So I thought I would just highlight a few of the items that we saw in the video just a few minutes ago. The video actually is quite wide-ranging. It covers a number of topics, so I won't go into any kind of detail into any of them. But I thought I might, in some cases, highlight a couple of key things, provide some data in a couple of other areas, and then take a look at some assertions that were made in the video that perhaps could need further clarification. So the one of the key idea behind this presentation, is on industrial policy. So what is industrial policy? We maybe start with that. And then I want to move on to the state of manufacturing, because that is often the focus of industrial policy. And we can take a look at some data about where manufacturing is at the moment in the United States and in a couple of other countries. What next? So what are the policies that were advocated, that have been advocated in this area? And then I will conclude with a few points about the video. So what is industrial policy? So in a nutshell, this is where the government is seeking to favor particular industries. It could be national defense, as was mentioned in the video, the healthcare industry, especially given COVID-19. There could be IT, the high-tech sector that is often seen as an industry worth targeting. And now we have things like electric vehicle technology and so on that has also become particularly interesting to governments around the world. So it turns out that it's not just the US that is talking of industrial policy, or China or Japan, but everyone to some extent or the other follows industrial policy. So China has a strategy called Made in China 2025, and their goal is to dominate certain high-tech sectors in the global market. And they have laid out some strategies which include providing subsidies to certain industries, to make use of their state-owned enterprises to pursue certain goals in those industries, and also rely on technology transfer, which perhaps we can discuss in the Q&A, has led to some contentious points with the United States and Europe. So that's Made in China 2025. Germany too has something called Industry 4.0, where again the focus is on high technology, integrating things like artificial intelligence and machine learning into manufacturing. And to some extent, the Made in China 2025 was based on the German model of this Industry 4.0 development. India too has its own industrial policy strategy called Make in India. And the idea is that in key sectors, a lot of manufacturing will occur in India itself and will serve to displace imports from other countries, in particular China. It has turned out that the war in Ukraine by Russia has provided a perhaps unintentional boost to this Make in India program in the area of defense spending, since India relies very heavily on Russia for its armaments, and relying on Russia seems a little problematic at the moment. There is a move in India towards increasing its manufacturing capacity rather quickly in the area of national defense. On the state of manufacturing, because this is often the focus of industrial policy, if you look at manufacturing as a percentage of GDP for a number of countries, here we are looking at the United States, Japan, Germany, and China. Generally, what you observe is a decline in manufacturing as a proportion of GDP in all countries, even in China. And this is a facet of economic development. As countries grow, the agricultural sector, which used to be dominant, tends to be replaced by industry or manufacturing. And then eventually, the service sector takes precedence and becomes the dominant sector in the economy. And so we saw this clearly play out in the developed countries, but you are starting to see this also in developing countries like China, Brazil, and India, and so on, that the relative importance of manufacturing tending to decline as countries become richer. Now, in this picture, the Chinese manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, around 2004 or so, it was over 30%, around 32% or so. That has now declined to about 26% of GDP. So manufacturing is in decline even in China, although as a percent of GDP, it's much higher compared to the other three industrialized countries in this graph, with the United States being the lowest, depicted by the lowest line on the picture. If you look at manufacturing in constant US dollars adjusted for inflation, there you find that the topmost line is actually the United States. So the United States is actually a manufacturing powerhouse compared with Japan and Germany, which are the two lines below. So even though manufacturing as a percent of GDP is going down, even though employment in manufacturing is going down substantially, the value of manufacturing, the output being produced, is actually increasing. And a lot of it is because of improvements in productivity. Now, there is one point on the graph, a blue dot that you might see corresponding to around 2015, and that is actually China. So China's manufacturing value is greater than the United States. On this graph, it comes to about $3.2 trillion. So China is the indisputable leader in manufacturing in the world today. There was a good deal of discussion about trade and how to deal with China and so on. So here is some data on the tariff imposed by different countries on imports of manufactured products. So in other words, are governments using tariffs or taxes to keep out imports of foreign manufactured goods. And I have highlighted there's a vertical line corresponding to the year 2001, which is when China joined the World Trade Organization. So before they joined the World Trade Organization, and China is depicted by that broken line at the top, they had fairly high tariffs on imports of foreign goods. At the beginning of this graph, it's over 35%. And then they join in 2001, which means they agree to abide by the rules of the World Trade Organization, which require countries to bring down their tariffs substantially. And that has actually occurred. So if you look at the tariffs for China, in 2001, it was around 12-13%. And now, if you look at 2020, it's close to developed country levels. United States, Japan, Germany, in other words, below 5%. That's the average tariff rate on foreign manufactured goods. So what next? Dealing with China, some strategies were laid out in the video. So quickly highlighting some of them. One of them, shift the supply chain to other countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and so on in Asia. Impose tariffs on Chinese goods. This was touted as one strategy to follow, and it was noted that the Biden administration continues to keep these tariffs on China that Trump had originally imposed when he was in the White House. Another strategy mentioned was to restrict high-tech exports to China, in part also because of fear of technology transfer that the Chinese government has been accused by the United States and Europe of carrying out. And finally, restrict FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows into China by US companies and also into the US by Chinese companies. And so these are some of the strategies that were mentioned in the sort of decoupling strategy pointed out in the video. And then the other strategy was for the United States itself to have a robust industrial policy where the US government would provide subsidies and so on to targeted industries like clean energy and ports and electric vehicles and so on. So finally, a few points about the video. We see that this sort of basic framework of demand and supply was used in the video to highlight a few points about prices and the capitalist economy and the capitalist philosophy and so on and so forth. So this is one of the assertions that was made in the video. It comes at about the 8:41 mark. If demand and supply meet, at that point, it is called equilibrium. The price of the product will be reasonable, and that is shown by that blue dot. So your price on the vertical axis, it is not clear what is on the horizontal axis. So let's take care of that part first. It is quantity of the good on the horizontal axis, and the intersection of demand and supply gives us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Whether the equilibrium price is reasonable or not, well, that is probably in the eye of the beholder. The second assertion that was made at about the 8:48 mark, if demand increases without an increase in supply, we are going to see an increase in the price of that product. There are fewer widgets and gadgets available compared to the demand for them. And so this is this assertion is supported, according to the speaker, by that blue dot. The price of the good has gone up when demand increased without an increase in supply. economics textbooks would not agree with this picture at all. So the relevant way to think about the framework would be something like this, where you have the initial demand and supply curves intersecting at a low price. But then if there's an increase in demand, then the entire demand curve is going to shift to the right. There's no change in the supply curve because that is what is being assumed in the statement. And the new intersection, the new equilibrium, corresponds to a higher price and higher quantity. So this graph would capture the idea of a situation when demand increases without an increase in supply. And the final assertion that was made in early 2020, when suddenly everyone in the world needed a mask because of COVID, a shock to the international system that pushed the demand to an extreme to the point that supply could never keep up. So the graph that was provided, it's a little busy, it's a little active. There's a lot of things going on that graph, but I think the main point is that blue dot. Everyone in the world needed a mask, so there was an increase in demand for masks, but supply could not keep up. So there's a blue dot somehow capturing this notion. But once again, this is not how an economist might look at it. So we could look at it in a slightly different way, which is if you have the demand for COVID masks going up, that means the entire demand curve shifts to the right. And we could argue in the very short run, the supply of COVID masks is fixed. So it's a vertical line. And so when the demand shifts out, you end up with a new equilibrium point and a higher price for the mask for a COVID mask. So this is perhaps a point of departure from that sort of approach that was taken in the video. And it's quite possible that there are some students of mine who are at the moment in the audience watching this video and discussion, and perhaps they might also note some of the discrepancies in how the demand supply framework, which is fundamental to a lot of analysis that we do, especially at the introductory level, how that framework, one has to be careful in how to use it. So with that having been said, I think, Russell, perhaps I shall stop here and turn it over to you and the audience for any kind of discussion that we could have.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you very, very much for that overview. Appreciate that. Because you just mentioned your students, I want to ask you about the level of expertise in economics that you think you see in Washington among the advisors to the last couple of administrations, and certainly among some of our elected leaders. If you were to give a grade to some of the folks in Washington when it comes to making decisions about tariffs and this, that, and the other on industrial policy, what might that be? How sophisticated is their understanding of economics?
Well, I think in my view, there is a distinct difference in the quality of the analysis that was carried out of economic policies under the Trump administration and what is carried out under the Biden administration. There is a very significant difference. And it was evident in some of the policies that were rolled out. For example, at one point, the Trump administration had rolled out a very significant tax policy proposal, the details of which were printed on one page. And that was it. That was the entire analysis for a major tax proposal. So there was a kind of cavalier attitude. And it's not clear from what source, but in general, the kind of analysis that was provided to support policy proposals was very weak, was very shoddily done. There were simple problems with Excel, use of Excel that should not have occurred, but those came to light. What you see in the Biden administration is what you normally see with economic advisors in the White House, which is they have impeccable credentials, people like Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary, and so on. There is very little doubt among economists that someone like Janet Yellen and some of the other folks who are in the White House, will analyze a policy or recommend policies without doing due diligence, without looking at the literature, for example, looking at the evidence, and then coming up with proposals. That does not mean, however, that those proposals necessarily will get through the legislative process in Washington, D.C. But at least the economic analysis part, I think we can be reasonably certain is going to be strong.
Very good, very good. One more question before we get to some of the questions that are coming in from the viewers this evening. Much of the video that we saw from the Foreign Policy Association points out, quite rightly, the importance of the relationship between the United States and China. A number of things were discussed about what we might want to do, shifting supply chains and this and that. You know, as we have witnessed the reportage on the war between Russia and Ukraine, it prompted a number of people to talk about, well, is this going to create an opportunity for China over Taiwan, perhaps to make moves, and might that cause these two powers, the United States and China, to come to the blows? And the argument has been, no, no, no. China and the United States are so economically integrated, it would be impossible. It would be mutual suicide for the two to ever go to war. And I'm just wondering if that argument is compelling for you. Is it persuasive? Or is it something that is, in fact, imagined?
If we look at history, I think the argument loses some of its power. If you look at the outbreak of World War I, before 1914, Europe was heavily integrated. There was a great deal of trade in goods, people could move about and so on. So you had a very integrated Europe before 1914, and yet they went to war. You could say a similar thing happened with World War II. While on the one hand, there are compelling business interests, for example, that would not like to see a war break out, but wars can break out for other reasons that can dominate these kinds of commercial or business interests.
Well, that's not very comforting to hear. That just because we are economically integrated, that doesn't mean that we might not come to blows. Here's another question or two about this relationship with this important trading partner. Are there any incentives that the world can offer China to persuade it to be a fair partner in international trade? Well, what do you say?
Yes, to an extent. So China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, when they were not in the World Trade Organization, they could pretty much pursue any policy they wanted. They didn't have to follow the rules of the World Trade Organization when they were outside the WTO. Now, having been brought into the ambit of the World Trade Organization, they have agreed to abide by the rules that the other 160 odd member states are following. And if they don't follow those rules, then there are procedures in place in Geneva to handle trade disputes. And you do find countries have brought complaints against China in certain industries, for example, where the Chinese government has been accused of providing subsidies and so on. But at the same time, China has also brought complaints against other countries. And so we now have a forum, the World Trade Organization, where these disputes can be handled. Perhaps they are not handled in a very expeditious manner in some cases, but there is a mechanism to deal with this, provided the World Trade Organization is allowed to function the way it is intended to function. One of the things that the Trump administration did was not permit certain judges in the World Trade Organization to get appointed, and that impeded the functioning of the dispute resolution mechanism at the WTO, which meant that trade disputes could not be adjudicated at the WTO, which was going on before, in previous years. Now, under Biden, the hope is that all those will be reversed, and we will get back to the business of handling these trade disputes and forcing China and other scofflaws, including the US in some cases, to abide by the rules that they have promised to abide by. So that, I think, is one mechanism to get China to cooperate in abiding by the rules, the global trade rules. The other is through trade agreements, regional trade agreements. Under President Obama, the United States had championed a trade agreement in Asia called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this was a collection of 12 countries, including the US. And this was going to be a very large trade agreement. This was. And China was deliberately excluded. They were not invited to be part of this club because the United States wanted to reduce China's influence in Asia. When Trump came to power, he took the United States out of the TPP, leaving it with 11 members. And those 11 members then reconstituted themselves into another version of TPP. But now China is going to be part of it. It's very likely that China will be part of the TPP, an organization that the United States had championed and built in part to reduce China's dominance in that part of the world. But so when China gets into these kinds of trade agreements, they have to abide by the rules of the agreement. So this is one of the requirements. And by and large, if they stray from it, there are mechanisms in place to impose tariffs and so on to get them to abide by the rules.
In fact, the TPP situation that you just mentioned was one of the very first acts of the Trump administration, getting us out of that organization, thereby allowing entry of the very country that had been excluded, giving them an enlarged or enhanced clout in that region. You know, you mentioned that the United States, that complaints have been made by China against the U.S. For trading infractions, et cetera, leads to this question. Has the United States and have other countries been playing with entirely clean hands? Has China had some legitimate complaints?
China has legitimate complaints about some of the trade policies that were used against it by the Trump administration. You may recall that Trump had imposed a series of increasingly harsh tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States. without much justification. And the Trump administration had, sort of scattershot approach when it came to imposing tariffs. Trump liked to be called the tariff man, and so tariffs were imposed, left and right on friend and foe alike. So there were a bunch of tariffs imposed on China. There were tariffs imposed on the European Union, to the great displeasure of our allies. Tariffs on Canada, on Mexico, on India, on a number of countries. So yes, and by and large, most of them were thoroughly unjustified, and using national security arguments to keep out BMW cars from the United States market. I mean, there was a sort of degree of absurdity to some of the claims being made to justify the imposition of some of these tariffs. Biden has rolled back some of them, perhaps not quickly enough. In the case of China, Biden has been much slower in reversing the Trump policies. But the US government also has a compelling rationale for putting some pressure on China to clean up its act. There is evidence of forced technology transfer, perhaps bordering on the theft of intellectual property. So those kinds of things cannot be overlooked. And so the US and the EU will take steps to deal with those kinds of situations. But it has to be done in a systematic, thoughtful fashion, and that was not pursued in the previous administration.
It's easy enough to see how the tariffs that are imposed on in a given industrial sector can enhance the profits of certain people stateside, certain companies. And so consequently, we can see how politics can certainly play into these things, something that is being masqueraded as national defense or security is in fact a sop for somebody in the steel industry, et cetera, which is exactly what we saw with the tariffs on the steel industry against, steel coming in from China. Here's a question though. Did the previous administration's tariffs hurt the US and the global economy, or would that be going too far?
No, it hurt the US economy. There are estimates of in studies that show what the overall impact of the tariffs was on the overall US economy. So as you point out, tariffs on one sector, for example, on steel, on imported steel, can benefit the domestic steel industry. So the steel firms will hire more workers, they will make more profits, and therefore the steel industry stands to benefit. However, the consumers of steel, and that would be a large swath of manufacturing in the United States. You're looking at the automobile sector, you're looking at appliances that use steel, you're looking at construction that uses steel. So any industry that uses steel as an input will face higher costs of production because steel has now become more expensive due to the tariff. And therefore, what is being gained by the steel industry in the United States comes at the expense of a higher cost of production for all consumers of steel, which eventually will get passed on to you and me in the form of higher prices for cars and houses and appliances and so on. So there are studies that have shown that the overall impact of these tariffs has been negative, while it may have conferred some small benefits for the affected industry.
Dr. Paul, final question. It's indisputable that offshoring is something that was fueled by the cost savings that companies could realize. Labor was cheaper elsewhere, so consequently, let us manufacture there and then bring things back. And of course, we can see concomitantly the export of jobs because of that. Well, there has been in the last several years much consternation over that and a move to reshore. Let's talk about bringing manufacturing back. Do you see much of that going on? Do you see that as a panacea? Is that something that is going to or is helping the United States economy? What do you say?
I don't think it will be a panacea, even if it can be done in any substantial fashion. As we saw in the data, manufacturing as a percentage of output, as a percentage of GDP, is not going to increase in any substantial fashion. This is simply a facet of what stage of economic development we are at. As countries become richer, the population demands more and more services. We like to consume more healthcare services. We like to consume more education services, more entertainment services. And so the demand for manufactured stuff tends to go down, relatively speaking. So it is quite unlikely that we are going to return to the glory days of very high manufacturing percent as a percent of GDP in the US economy or any developed country for that matter. So to some extent, these efforts at bringing back manufacturing in a large way are probably not going to move the needle that much in terms of overall manufacturing in the United States. You will have a few cases, certainly, where companies might decide to come back to the US to avoid instability and so on and so forth. But in terms of large shifts, I don't see that happening.
Despite what I just said about final question, there is one more that about the U.S.-China relationship. I want to just throw this one out to you. Do you regard that relationship as a zero-sum game? So what implications do you see there? And what about with other nations? This is a question from a gentleman named Richard. What do you say?
I can talk about international trade, not other aspects of the relationship, say, between the US and other countries. In the area of international trade, trade is not a zero-sum game. Trade is something that could enrich and tends to enrich both parties. And this has been the evidence from decades of seeing globalization, of seeing more international trade occurring between countries. There are many mechanisms by which this can benefit countries, but at the same time, we should not overlook the possibility that increased trade, increased globalization could also leave certain groups within a country worse off. So the challenge is, how does society deal with the losses that could be incurred in certain sections of society, the jobs that are going to be lost due to increased competition from abroad? How can society deal with those while preserving the gains, the substantial gains that come from engaging in international trade? And that is the challenge.
Well, as I said at the top of the discussion this evening, I believe that this is an extraordinarily important area. And I do believe, Dr. Sanjay Paul, you have proved that tonight. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
very much.
Sanjay Paul, Elizabethtown College, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Thank you as well.
Thank you,
Now,
Dr.
back to
Paul.
Joyce.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Russell. Thank you, Joyce.
everyone. It's great to have you here. And Dr. Paul, you did a fantastic job of making a very complex topic at least a little more understandable to us. It is still complex. And thank you, moderator Russell Goodman, for bringing those pithy questions to the fore tonight. So with that, thank you. And certainly, Dr. Paul, we will be calling on you again. Good
Thank you
night.
very much.
All right.